It all started early one morning, just after 6 o'clock, in a quiet, upscale neighborhood in Greater Manchester. A Porsche was parked in its usual spot outside a modern, expensive-looking apartment. Inside that apartment, everything was perfectly clean and tidy. It was the kind of place that looked like it was straight out of a magazine. The owner, a man named Aram Shabani, was still asleep. The first sound he heard was a knock on the door. It wasn't a friendly knock. It was heavy and official. A moment later, he heard the loud crash of a police ram breaking through his front door. But by the time officers were inside, Shabani was already on his feet and in the bathroom. He wasn't trying to run or hide. He was trying to erase his entire life. In his hand was a special kind of phone, the kind you can't just buy at a regular store. It was heavily encrypted, and with the press of a button, it could be wiped completely clean. As the police stormed in, he smashed the device and shoved the broken pieces down the toilet, flushing away any evidence it held. He was panicking, but he was doing it quietly. Men like Shabani don't usually make a lot of noise. They think and they plan. He probably thought if he could just destroy the phone, he might get away, but he was wrong. What the police found inside his home told a much different story. As they searched the apartment, they started finding things that didn't fit with the clean, minimalist decor. They found large stacks of cash just sitting there. They found bags of high-quality cocaine. On the wall, instead of a normal painting, hung an original piece of art by the famous artist Andy Warhol. Tucked away in safes, they found recovery codes for cryptocurrency accounts, which are like secret passwords to digital money. This luxury apartment wasn't just a home, it was the command center for a massive drug operation that stretched across the world. So, how did one man build this kind of criminal empire right under everyone's noses? Well, on the surface, Aram Shabani looked like a legitimate, successful businessman. If you were a bank or a lender, his file would look pretty impressive. He had a great credit score and a portfolio of properties in major cities like Manchester and London, and even some overseas. All the paperwork made him look like a smart investor who had made his fortune all by himself. But if you dug just a little deeper, you'd find that it was all an illusion. There was no real company bringing in all this money. There were no tax returns filed for any legitimate business. In fact, over a period of more than 10 years, he had only officially declared any income 5 times. And each of those times, it was just so he could apply for a mortgage to buy another property. Every single one of those mortgage applications was built on lies. He used forged documents to trick the banks. The payslips he showed them were fake. The bank statements were doctored to show money that wasn't really there. He even faked the official tax forms and gave himself made-up job titles to look more important. And for a long time, it actually worked. Over and over again, he managed to convince banks and lenders to give him huge loans, often worth hundreds of thousands of pounds. He had a clever system. He would buy a property, then take out another mortgage on it to pull cash out. He'd then use that cash to buy yet another property. He was constantly moving money and assets around between his different homes in Manchester, London, and even on the sunny coast of Spain. What looked like a growing property empire was really just a very complicated way to hide and clean his drug money. He almost never bought the homes in his own name. Instead, he used other people, friends, family members, and business associates to act as a front for him. They would make the purchases on his behalf. Then, a little while later, those same properties would be quietly transferred over to Shabani's name, officially and legally, but with no money ever changing hands. The whole process was designed to be confusing. He never did things the same way twice. Sometimes he would buy a property outright with cash that couldn't be traced. Other times, he would use his fake income records to get loans through other people. For example, one of his flats in the very wealthy Kensington area of London, worth over £1.7 million, was simply handed over to him with no record of him ever paying for it. Another property was held in someone else's name for a short time before being moved to a company that Shabani secretly controlled.
The detectives who finally unraveled this scheme called it laundering through architecture. Every property was like another layer of disguise. Every signature on a document was meant to throw people off the scent. The paperwork all looked perfectly legal until you started to ask the one simple question: where did the money originally come from? When the financial investigation team at the Greater Manchester Police finally did ask that question, his entire empire began to crumble. By 2019, Shabani controlled properties worth over £5 million, and not a single penny of it could be linked to a legitimate job or a lawful business. For 20 years, he hadn't worked a real day in his life. He had used smoke and mirrors to live the life of a millionaire without anyone ever asking the right questions. And he wasn't quiet about his wealth. He didn't hide his money away, he wore it. He had expensive watches, a fleet of luxury cars, designer clothes, and a collection of fine art. Nothing about his lifestyle was subtle. This wasn't just about spending money. For Aram Shabani, it was a performance. He would travel to places like Ibiza, where he'd rent enormous villas and post photos of himself on private yachts. He once flew to Los Angeles and paid nearly £31,000 for a hair transplant, all in cash. He did it again in Istanbul for a similar price. He got dental veneers and booked other cosmetic procedures, always paying with cash to make sure it couldn't be traced back to him. It was all part of building an image, a young, confident, and successful man with endless money. If you asked his friends where the money came from, they might say he was in property, or maybe that he traded watches or currencies. But the stories never quite added up. There was no visible business, no office, no public record of his work. There was just the wealth, which seemed to appear out of nowhere. He drove a Porsche Panamera, and not one, but 2 Bentleys. He took holidays in Dubai, Amsterdam, and Marbella. He bought original artwork by Banksy and Andy Warhol. Not prints you could buy online, but genuine pieces from galleries. When the police raided his apartment, they found them hanging on his walls. They later proved he had bought them with the proceeds of his criminal activities. His lifestyle was carefully managed. The photos he posted online were chosen to show off his wealth. Designer brand names were always visible in his pictures. He would often crop other people's faces out of his photos to keep the focus on himself. He posted from rooftop bars, fancy beach clubs, and the balconies of 5-star hotels. But you would never see a picture of him in a boardroom or at a desk. There was never any sign of work. To the investigators, it was all a mask, but it was a very good one. For years, this flashy lifestyle convinced everyone, from the banks lending him money to his own neighbors and friends, that he was a legitimate businessman. The logic seemed simple. Surely a man living so openly, showing off his wealth like that, couldn't be a major criminal on the run from the law. He was hiding in plain sight. But he couldn't stay hidden forever. Even with all his careful planning and his perfect public image, detectives were already starting to pay very close attention. So the police knew Shabani was living a life that didn't make sense. The fancy cars, the designer clothes, the international travel, it was all being paid for by something, but it wasn't a 9-to-5 job. They weren't just watching him spend money. They were building a map. They would see a flight booking to a luxury resort and then try to figure out where the cash to pay for it came from. The more they looked, the clearer the picture became. His entire life wasn't built on success. It was built on a very convincing lie, funded by the profits from selling illegal drugs.
The problem for investigators was that Shabani was very careful with his digital footprint. But they knew the money had to be coming from somewhere. They looked at his travel history between 2012 and 2015. He was constantly on the move, flying to places like Dubai, Amsterdam, and Ibiza. These were the trips he loved to post about online. But one trip in particular didn't fit the pattern. In December of 2013, he flew to Colombia. This trip was different from all the others. There were no pictures from fancy clubs, no selfies on the beach, and no posts checking in at the airport. For a man who seemed to document every part of his glamorous life, this sudden silence was a huge red flag for the detectives. They spotted the gap in his social media right away. To them, Colombia wasn't just another holiday destination. For decades, it's been known as one of the world's biggest sources of high-purity cocaine. They couldn't follow the paper trail of his money, but they could follow his silence. He used encrypted chats and burner phones, which made it nearly impossible to see who he was talking to. But his travel told its own story. The police realized he wasn't flying to Colombia to party. He was going there to do business. He was building relationships with suppliers, setting up ways to import drugs into the UK, and meeting contacts that he definitely didn't want to be photographed with. Later in the investigation, the police were able to connect his trips to South America with large purchases made back in the UK. These weren't purchases for a normal person. They were for things like industrial packaging materials and high-powered vacuum sealers. It all pointed to a wholesale supply operation. This guy wasn't a small-time dealer selling on a street corner. He was at the top of the chain, moving huge quantities. The trip to Colombia changed everything. It showed the police they weren't dealing with just a distributor. They were dealing with a major international trafficker who was connected directly to the source.
The day it all came to an end was Tuesday, April 9th, 2019. Just after 6 in the morning, police teams got ready to raid several locations at once, both in the UK and in other countries. The main target was Aram Shabani's luxury apartment in Bowden, the one in the old converted church with the private gated parking. He was still in bed when the police used a ram to smash the front door completely off its hinges. By the time officers were inside, he was already in the bathroom, desperately trying to destroy his encrypted phone. He smashed it into pieces, threw it in the toilet, and flushed. When the police found him, he didn't say a word. They put him in handcuffs while he was still in his boxer shorts. The carefully crafted image of the man in designer suits on private jets was gone. All that was left was a man in his underwear, surrounded by police in his bathroom. His silence didn't matter anymore because his apartment did all the talking. Inside a safe, police found over £60,000 in cash. They also found the secret recovery phrases for his cryptocurrency accounts and a small amount of cocaine. At the exact same time, another team of officers was raiding his second apartment in Kensington, in West London. There, they found what they described as a party box, which was a stash of different drugs, including cocaine and ecstasy. That apartment looked less like a home and more like an art gallery. The original paintings by Banksy and Andy Warhol were hanging on the walls. The police would later prove they were bought with criminal money. The police also had warrants to open 3 of his safety deposit boxes at a bank. When they opened them, they found over £1 million in cash, all neatly bundled and organized. A third investigation at a property he used in Ibiza uncovered paperwork, tenancy agreements, and old boarding passes that showed just how much he was moving between countries. He hadn't just been traveling for fun. He had built a whole system that allowed him to slip across borders without anyone noticing. The raids didn't just find drugs and money, they tore down the whole stage show. For the first time in 20 years, Aram Shabani's silence wasn't enough to protect him. The drugs were real, and the money was very real. But what made his operation so successful for so long was everything he built around it. The investigation was now broken into 2 parts.
First, there was the physical evidence, the stuff the police could see and touch, like the cash, the drugs, and the broken phones. The second part was much harder. They had to piece together the digital trail he had tried so hard to erase. Let's talk about that physical evidence. Shabani didn't just hide his cash and drugs. He protected them like a professional. Inside his apartments, officers found all the tools of a high-level criminal. They found evidence that he owned 11 different cash-counting machines. These are the kind of machines banks use, designed to count thousands of pounds in just a few minutes. They only found 3 of them, but they found receipts and bank records for the other 8.
They also found vacuum sealers, large amounts of plastic wrapping, and bottles of acetone, a chemical used in the drug packaging process. On their own, these items might seem normal, but when found all together, they told a clear story. He had turned his luxury apartments into quiet, hidden-away packaging labs. To communicate, Shabani used those special encrypted phones from a company called encrypted. His username on the secret network was Iron Key. The police also found a crypto recovery code that gave them access to over 1.5 million pounds in digital currency. As for the phones themselves, 2 of them had been smashed and flushed down toilets at his properties. One was so badly damaged that when forensics experts finally recovered it from the drain pipe, it was still in tiny pieces. His whole world was built on secrets, and now the police were finally starting to uncover them, one broken piece at a time. So Aram Shabani was in custody, but his secrets were still locked away on his devices. He thought that if he just stayed quiet, he could still protect himself. This silence had been his greatest weapon for 20 years, and he wasn't about to give it up now. Even after he was arrested and sitting in a police station, Aram Shabani stuck to his old habit, silence. The police asked him for the PIN codes and passwords to his devices, and he refused to give them anything. He thought if they couldn't get into his phones and computers, they couldn't prove anything. Some of his devices were so well encrypted that, to this day, investigators have never been able to unlock them. But in the end, it didn't matter. The police had a different plan. They didn't need to get inside his head because they had already gathered a mountain of evidence from the world all around him. They had the receipts for the cash-counting machines, the backups from his online accounts, and duplicate files he didn't even know existed. His phones and laptops weren't just fancy gadgets. They were the tools he used to run his business. But even the best encryption in the world couldn't hide the digital footprints he had left everywhere else. The police raids were just the start. The team at Greater Manchester Police didn't just stop with what they found in his apartments and safety deposit boxes. They started one of the biggest and most complicated digital investigations they had ever worked on. They began pulling together every piece of digital information connected to him they could find. We're talking about more than 1 million separate documents. They looked at everything from his online shopping history to flight records to old email accounts he thought he had deleted. Every single file was like one piece of a giant puzzle.
As they put the puzzle together, the picture of his criminal empire became crystal clear. They found records of him moving money to other countries through fake companies that only existed on paper. They found dozens of mortgage applications that had been filed using the exact same forged documents. They even found insurance policies for properties that weren't officially in his name, but that he had paid for with his own credit cards. His spending habits told a story all on their own. They could see all the high-end purchases he made in Dubai and the expensive club bookings in Amsterdam. They saw tens of thousands of pounds spent in Los Angeles, and the dates on his hotel bills perfectly matched the dates of his hair transplant surgery. Even the cash, which he thought was untraceable, started to form a pattern. On 2 separate occasions, he had been stopped at UK airports carrying huge amounts of cash, over 42,000 pounds in total, that he hadn't declared. At the time, he claimed it was just spending money for his trips. But investigators were now able to trace that same cash back to his mortgage payments and his cryptocurrency purchases. They found emails that connected his known addresses to property listings under completely different names. They found payment records that matched receipts from his trips abroad. They mapped out how he moved his cryptocurrency between dozens of different digital wallets, creating a confusing web of transactions designed to hide where the money first came from. It didn't matter that some of his devices were still locked. What mattered were the shadows and echoes they left behind in the digital world. He thought he was being clever, but he had left clues everywhere. Slowly but surely, the case against him was becoming impossible to deny. The trial finally began in the middle of 2021 at Manchester Crown Court and lasted for 10 weeks. The courtroom wasn't a place for big, dramatic speeches. Instead, it was quiet and methodical, just like the investigation. And through it all, Aram Shabani stuck to his strategy of silence. He denied everything. He sat there every single day and didn't offer one single explanation for the millions of pounds, the bags of drugs, and the smashed encrypted phones that were found in his homes. He was facing 20 different charges, including conspiracy to supply cocaine, money laundering, and fraud.
He was even charged with perverting the course of justice for refusing to unlock his devices for the police. But even then, with all the evidence laid out in front of him, he said nothing. In the end, the jury didn't need to hear his side of the story. They didn't need his passwords. They had the documents, the travel records, the bank statements, and the trail of properties all tied together by his lies. The prosecution painted a clear picture for the jury. They described his entire operation as being carefully planned and totally controlled. They showed how every part of his lifestyle, the cars, the artwork, the cosmetic surgery, was paid for with drug money and protected by a wall of deception. When it was time for the judge to deliver the sentence, he was direct. He told the court that Shabani was at the very top of a large-scale international drug conspiracy. He was sentenced to 34 years in prison for his main crimes. Then, the judge added another 3 years to his sentence, specifically because he refused to give the police access to his encrypted evidence. His silence had finally cost him. But the story doesn't end there. 2 years after he was sent to prison, the case was brought back to court. This time, it wasn't about his jail sentence, it was about his money. In April of 2024, at a special hearing, the court ordered Aram Shabani to pay back £3.4 million of his criminal earnings. This wasn't a request. He was given just 3 months to pay it all back. And if he didn't or couldn't, he would face an extra 10 years in prison. The police had already taken his cash, his properties, and his crypto. But this was about sending a message. It was about destroying the idea that you can build an empire with drug money and still get to keep all the nice things you bought with it. The court made it clear that this wasn't just unexplained wealth. It was the proceeds of crime, and every last pound was going to be taken back. Aram Shabani spent 2 decades building a life that looked perfect on the outside, but was completely hollow on the inside. In the end, all it took was one morning for the whole thing to vanish, leaving nothing behind but a long prison sentence and a powerful lesson. No matter how quietly you operate, the truth always finds a way to make itself heard. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel.